Hello and welcome to the Lively Faith Podcast. I'm your host, the Reverend Nathan Stomberg, and today I'm joined by my co-host, the Reverend Mark Galloway. Today we're going to be talking about C.S. Lewis and a book of his that I read just recently, The Abolition of Man. Really loved it, and I think there's a lot of really relevant topics for us to discuss. So I took down some notes, and we're just going to go through and talk about things as they come up here. But I also think you can't go wrong with C.S. Lewis, right?
No.
It's the premier Anglican apologist and really apologist and philosopher, theologian of the 20th century as far as Protestant, or I'm trying to think of...
Yeah, well, Lewis, not to interrupt you, Lewis,
no,
Lewis
I'm trying
is
to
such
think
a
of my words
hybrid,
here.
is that if you know this, if you read Catholic apologists, they quote Lewis as much as anybody else in the 20th century. Because he's a high church Anglican.
Right.
And I would say he's the best apologist of the 20th century, Christian apologist, period.
And one of the testaments to his greatness is that everyone wants to claim him as their own.
Oh, yes.
So the low church
Every
do, the
evangelical
Protestants,
claims
the
him.
evangelicals, the Roman Catholics like to
Right.
quote him. So he is a man of all seasons there.
Right.
So C.S. Lewis, he was born 1898, died in 1963. He was an Oxford Fellow. He was appointed chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge in 1954.
Just some trivia. He died the same day as John F. Kennedy.
Huh.
And because of that, he kind of got lost to history for a while because of the Kennedy phenomenon, but that's just a sidetrack.
That is interesting. And famously, I think, for those who are less familiar with him, right, he's known for authoring the Chronicles of Narnia. Mere Christianity is probably his most famous Christian work, Christian apologetic book. And one of his hallmarks, which I really enjoy, everyone really enjoys about him, is his accessibility. He writes in a way that is easily digestible, but yet very deep, very concise, and conveys a lot with very few words. We've talked about before, I think the modern analog for him, closest you could probably come, is Peter Kraft.
Yes.
On the Catholic side, the philosopher writes very concisely, says a lot with very few words, but as far as a philosophical level goes, is very, very accessible
I
to
don't
read.
think he has an evangelical equivalent.
No, definitely not.
No.
Definitely not.
No. Mere Christianity was actually a set of lectures that he gave to the BBC that was compiled into what became a book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So C.S. Lewis, I think, we could talk endlessly about him, and you really can't go wrong with, I'm really struggling for words here. Why don't we just jump into the notes, and we will start talking about Abolition of Man. So I picked up this book, so I received a gift set of C.S. Lewis books, Mere Christianity among them, Abolition of Man. So I recently got into this one, and I couldn't resist taking notes while I was reading. It was just so much packed in there. And really starting with chapter 1, Abolition of Man, he begins by talking about two authors who he feels are indoctrinating students in the rejection of absolute truth. So he assigns two names to them, Gaius and Titius, and he uses them as pseudonyms as to not out the actual authors of this book. This textbook, so very, very polite, very English of him. And he argues that the modernist rejection of absolute truth and for the correspondence theory of truth and reality, the fact that truth is objective and there is a reality that corresponds to that truth itself. But so as we jump into this here, I just find that these arguments are so relevant to us today, and there is a lot that we can apply to it.
That's the thing about very few authors, right? They can transcend generations. He's been dead 60 years, and yet his arguments, his apologia about absolute truth is as relevant today as it was the day he wrote.
Yes.
And it's still as irrefutable as it was the day he wrote it.
Yeah, his arguments really stand the test of time. So Lewis's concern in his day and age was that the cynicism and rationalism was going to make children into dullards. And I think modern age, right? Well, what are we looking at here? But I think I think where his argument diverges from what we see in the modern age is C.S. Lewis was more concerned with cold, hard rationalism taking over and drowning out truth and beauty, whereas what we see is an emotivism. So it's really not rationalism.
Good point.
It's the same dynamic, but it's an emotivism that has taken over and crowded out truth and reality and discourse and in education. So without this objective truth corresponding to objective morality, then moderns were forced to conjure up their own new sentiments and attribute them to existing objects. So one of the things that Lewis uses to illustrate this is like poultry keepers who raise young chickens and they make them for thus and thus purposes of which the birds know nothing. So this is describing the modern education system where there are educators, he asserts, through the authors of these textbooks, this textbook, who have their own purposes and their own worldview that they are pushing upon children, and the children go through the system, they're raised, yet they know nothing, the parents know nothing of which the children are being taught. They don't yet realize, it's like the frog being boiled in water,
Right.
that you're receiving this whole contrary worldview to maybe what your parents are raising you
Is
in.
that not what's going on right now?
Absolutely.
Right. Mommy and daddy send a kid off to first grade thinking they're actually learning to read and write, and they're learning all kinds of other things but those things.
Right.
And then they get to proficiency exams and they can't read or write at all by the time they're in sixth grade.
So with that, what he arrives at the end of the first chapter is men without chests, which he then expands upon later on, but that's what you get, is men without chest, men devoid of virtue, and that's where the chest comes in, that Lewis argues that without true emotion or passions. But today I would argue again where the divergence is, if his concern was men without emotion or passion, I would say we have men who are overcome by emotion and passion and therefore lack any sort of moral courage and integrity, because the passions are not for the good, the true, and the beautiful, all of which have been sacrificed, but they're passionate for other desires of the flesh, let's say. And the good, the true, and the beautiful are necessary for the corresponding theory, the correspondence theory of reality, because those are the things which God in creation has made to abide. And these are the good things that he brings forth.
Mm-hmm.
So that brings us to chapter 2, and here C.S. Lewis discusses what he calls, or what is known as the Tao. In other words, it's known as the Way. And C.S. Lewis, much like Peter Kreeft too, has a way of bringing in and incorporating ideas from other philosophies that are not necessarily Christianity in order to point to what is true about them and then highlight what is true about the true truth
Kind of
of Christianity.
Thomas Merton type of thing.
I'm not familiar with him.
Yeah, Merton does this with some Eastern thought and write a very famous book, Seven-Storied Mountain, where he does similar things. Lewis would have been very familiar with it. There's some variation to it, but it's a common theme to it.
And so what I like about chapter 2 is he gets into the idea of debunking things. He gets into an argument against deconstructionism. So these two authors, which he is criticizing, he points out that they do hold objective values in contempt, but they still must necessarily hold some values of their own, which cannot be questioned, right? Because if everything is relative, then you yourself can't affirm anything to be true. So ultimately, it's the values that they hold near and dear that are the ones that are exempt from being debunked or deconstructed. But everyone else's values, well, those are fair game.
Yeah.
And so otherwise, like, reading their book would be pointless, he argues, because if nothing is objective, then how possibly can you read and understand it? So then he takes some examples. He talks about dying for friends or family or country doesn't provide satisfaction for the individual because he is dead, forcing the elites to say that instinct is something we ought to obey. And so here he pushes forward the idea of this infinite regress of instincts. So there's a phenomenon here that he discusses where there is a rise in this moral zeitgeist, a spirit of the age, popular values of what he would say are the elites between the First and Second World Wars. And basically, they want to explain everything through rationality that lent itself to instinct. So this harkens more toward a fascination or popularity with Darwinist evolutionary theory that, man is an animal, and though we are rational, we are also controlled by our own underlying animal instincts. And so C.S. Lewis goes on and explains that though you can get so far with instincts, you cannot explain certain subsets of actions by instinct alone, because much like with evolutionary theory and natural selection, they are incomplete as philosophies. So he ends up proposing it as the dilemma of ought. You can't describe an ought as in what someone should do or ought to do by mere instinct alone. So that's where the illustration of dying for someone's laying down one's life out of love, for example, cannot be explained by instinct or by evolutionary theory. And you can't discern between instincts either without an appeal to something higher than that instinct, right? So if all you have is instinct, and you have an instinct to kill, an instinct to eat, an instinct to breed, an instinct to save someone, what do you use as a means of judging between the two as to what is done at any given time? So you unnecessarily need an external value system in order to make those moral judgments. He also goes on, he mentions there's no instinct for the future preservation of the species, and that's demonstrated through human behavior. So there's an instinct to care for our children, but that fades quickly the more you abstract out into the future. So we don't have like a reflexive love for, what does he say here? There's no reflexive love for the distant future so much as we do of our own immediate family, but we do flout our concern for the whole human race when we talk about things like neglecting our children and tossing them into the state education system in the name of progress. So he calls out a disconnect there too. Again, like we like to signal our own moral virtue, right, when we talk about issues of climate and environment, that we're trying to save the world and we're making the world a better place, and we need the state to educate our children and teach them about these values that we hold dear, while at the same time we're really neglecting the issues and the values of the family, the nuclear family, to actually raise them up in the way in which God has intended. So again, there's a dichotomy there that was true even back in C.S. Lewis's day that I think has really remained unchanged and is really prophetic for modern times.
Yes. There's a line in here from Abolition of Man where Lewis is talking about natural law.
Yes.
So, he's much like Aquinas, right? Where he's always ahead of you. He's always thinking what the opposition's going to be talking about. So, and as he says about natural law is the sole source of all value judgments. If it is rejected, all value is rejected, right? Which Darwinistic theory could never explain, right? So he's building this distance with kind of left and right walls from Darwinistic theory without, and Lewis would never completely distance himself from natural selection necessarily, right? But he's talking about this spark that makes humans distinct comes from natural law. And once you get rid of natural law, you only can reduce humanity to this instinctual animal that will do anything to survive without any thought for the common good of the rest of humanity, right? And so without natural law, we only can live in chaos and eventually have self-destruction.
Absolutely.
As a species, And
absolutely.
So, Lewis is so brilliant as, he's not a trained theologian, No training in theology at all. He's a literary genius, right?
Yeah.
He's an Oxford Don, and he rises to prominence because of his children's literature, right? Only God could do things like this, right? So he writes Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe and all these other different things, and then he really has this conversion because Lewis was in the trenches in World War One, and he came out of an atheist, and then life experience does what it does, and he has this kind of evolutionary incremental process towards faith, and eventually faith wins out big time. One of my favorite books by him is Surprised by Joy, right? And he ends up falling in love with a woman named Joy, and it's a catch on both that he's a lifelong bachelor, Oxford Don, and this woman with cancer becomes the love of his life. But it's a dual reality, the title. It's not just that he learns this self-sacrificial love towards this woman who's terminally ill, and he's willing to protect and defend her any way he has to with agape love. But it's also, he's surprised by the joy of God's love for him, right? And that shapes his whole last decade and a half of his writings, theological writings, and so forth. And of course, what makes Lewis so unique is he goes beyond children's literature to theology, which simply comes out of his head in his reading, but not because he isn't getting his PhD from Oxford or Cambridge. And then he's able to brilliantly wrap it into science fiction.
Yeah.
Take Christian theology, and he has no peer in the West this way, and he takes it and wraps it into the genre that's growing at that point at a very quick rate, coming out of the beginning of the rocket age and the space age and all that stuff. And he brilliantly wraps it into science fiction, which has endured to this day. People gobble up his books.
Oh, it's incredibly prophetic.
Because inside of it is just this profound theology about natural law and the omniscience of God, right? He's really completely unique, and there's been movies about him, and there was a very good biography that came out about 10 years ago about him. So Lewis never goes away.
Yeah.
And it's pretty cool. But this is a very important book, The Abolition of Man.
It is, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's so many arguments that he makes inside it that it's hard to, I think, pick just one to focus on. He talks a lot in that second chapter when he's talking about natural law, about the power that is exerted over something when you exercise authority over it. So he talks about man wanting to exert power over nature, right? And especially early in the 20th century with a rapid increase in technological advancement, which we see is even more rapid today, man is always boasting about this new power that he has over nature. And philosophically, what he says is that when this power is exerted, you relativize the importance or the power over this thing that you've conquered. So he talks about airplanes, how man has conquered the air, or wireless, how man has conquered the airways and ways in which to communicate with one another. And then he also goes on and he applies that same logic to contraceptives. And now all of a sudden, man is saying, oh, well, we've conquered nature. We have now separated sex and procreation. But now who are you subjugating when you exercise power over the procreative act? It's not like with the airplane where now you're just saying, oh, okay, well, we can fly through the air. You're now inherently weakening future generations. You are subjugating and snuffing out the potential of a future generation of human beings. So you're actually exponentially detracting from generations and generations afterward.
C.S. Lewis is a pain in the behind. We did our episode on IVF, right?
Right.
Whatever, a couple months ago. C.S. Lewis, who's quoted endlessly by evangelicals as if he was an evangelical Protestant, which he wasn't, right? And certain Roman Catholics. But he's a pain because what he's saying contradicts the things they try to get around natural law with, around
Right.
these issues, right? He's really a precursor, isn't he? He's an Anglican prophetic forerunner, like a John the Baptist, of Pope Paul VI Humanae Vitae.
Yeah, that's a great point. That is a great analogy.
And ironically, it was one of the great mistakes of Christian history, the Lambeth Conference of Anglican Bishops in 1930, that opened a crack. And it's a bit not assessed accurately. It was very conditional, but they opened a crack to artificial birth control. And the abolition of man, and then subsequently, and through science fiction and his other writings, he's like, that's just dead wrong. It's just dead wrong, because this is what it leads to, right? Devalues life, devalues the role of women. It'll take away the responsibility of men having to be protector of women, of their husbands, to be the head of the family, right? As we know famously, St. Paul's words, we both know, in the Greek it comes out so powerfully. The role of the husband is to put his cloak around his wife.
Yeah.
Not because she's inferior, but because she's the ultimate gift God gives to you, right? And Lewis was all over it, way ahead of the game, right? Humanae Vitae doesn't come out until 1969. And,
he's
decades he's writing in the 1950s.
Right.
Right? And because Anglicanism, like so often when you have a persona like Lewis, though he's more famous in death than he was in life, right?
Yeah.
And so then you want to grab him, but the liberal Anglican establishment starts to distance themselves from Lewis because they don't like what he's saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And that's why he's become so... I'm convinced, you can tell me in your experience as a priest, have you found tons of lay Roman Catholics think C.S. Lewis is a Catholic?
Yeah, they treat him as such. Even Catholics who will speak pejoratively about the Anglican Church being the Church of Henry's hormones.
Yeah.
They still try to claim C.S. Lewis as their own and quote him quite fondly.
Yeah, even people like Taylor Marshall, once in a while he throws on Lewis, and then he's got to put the caveat. Yeah. Well, Lewis wasn't, and I understand why he does it. Lewis wasn't a Catholic, but that's because they don't have anybody any better saying the things that Lewis was saying at the time, and even to this day, right?
Yeah.
Because after Humanae Vitae, there was a huge backlash to Humanae Vitae, including some of the most preeminent theologians in the hierarchy and around the world dissenting against Humanae Vitae. And quite frankly, Humanae Vitae isn't followed by 2% of Catholics around the world.
Yep.
But Lewis was talking about these things in the 50s and in the most profound and effective way, and not in the type of language that you get in paragraph form in Humanae Vitae.
Yeah.
It's much more rounded and expanded, and
So listen.
Brilliant mind.
And he has such a way of writing things. And so listen to this quote about what we were just discussing, like the impact on future generations when we exert our own selfishness upon them. He says, for if a race shrinks, the later generations exist closer to their own extinction. So the last men, far from being the heirs of power, will be of all men most subject to the dead hand of the great planners and conditioners, and will themselves exercise least power upon the future. Thus the generation who exercises maximum power over future generations is liberated from tradition and drastically reduces the power, or to the detriment of the generations that come after it. So he says, the power of men to make himself what he pleases means, as we have seen, the power of some men to make other men what they please.
That's unbelievable, isn't that quote? Just as I think you reading that, and I think about what's tumbling at us at this meteoric rate with the birth rate around the world, right? China forces this one child, was it 40 years ago? China
Something like
forces this, right? So one kid, right, for each couple. So now China needs 150 million people. But they're 40 years, and even though they're this communist mess hole, right, they can't get women to have any children. Because there are 4 generations, the women having one child and aborting hundreds of millions of babies. And now they're like, you need to have children. And they're like
what?
we're not having children.
Yeah.
We just got to barely what we might consider wouldn't be middle class in America, but it is in China. And they're like, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
And so they're paying this price, right? And there's this myth in America, in the world, there's too many people. The more technological you become, the more people you need, right? And so you have Europe that has a birth rate of 1.1. America's down to 1.6, right? So Europe's going to go away, right? Why? Because the culture of death prevailed, right? And Lewis was right. Paul VI was right. Lambeth, 1930, was dead wrong, right? And the progressive liberal Protestant establishment, which has destroyed Europe, is trying to somehow rationalize that they were right all along, and they were wrong all along. And it's the genocide of their culture.
And C.S. Lewis saw it coming 80 years ago. So, in other words, man's conquest of nature, Lewis asserts, and reshaping of his own nature and desires, in fact, destroys his humanity altogether.
Right.
So it's a total irony that with every technological advancement, we think that we are superseding our own humanity and becoming something greater.
Right.
When in actuality, we are making ourselves lesser and lesser and lesser because of it.
So when I'm hopefully approaching the beatific vision in some time in the future, and you two are older men, right? I'm not going to try to be a prophet like C.S. Lewis to an extent. I would say more people are going to be born artificially than by conjugal union.
I don't know at what point in time that happens, but I think you do arrive at that point by necessity in certain
Just for
Western
survival
cultures.
of the human race.
Right, because you'll need some mechanism in order to propagate the species. You look at a place like Japan and South Korea, who are so much farther along. And Japan is really, I think, the bleeding edge of demographic upheaval. So really, if we want to understand what our future looks like if things don't change, then you look at Japan and see how they're closing schools and they have to rely increasingly on robotics and technology to help care for their
Everybody else is
aging.
old.
Yeah.
Right? Go back to our last podcast that we taped, and we talked about the issues faced in America, right? And we talked about clergymen without chest who don't talk the truth, right? I gave the example about when Ben Shapiro was in front of Congress. He's like, listen, you can talk to me all you want. You lie about everything. Mm-hmm. It's just a lie. You know it's a lie. Everybody in this room knows it's a lie. And you don't like me because I tell the truth. And so it is about the birth rate in America, right? We won't deal with the truth that we have to have children. And you have children by having men and women married in a covenant of matrimony that is lifelong and is dedicated until your death, and you raise your children in that covenant so that you perpetuate not just the human race, but a culture, a religion that bases culture on natural law. And that's the only answer. But it will never be spoken in the political sphere.
Yeah, it's funny you mention that because even on our own platforms, that topic does not get the same amount of attention as the other stuff we talk about. Is, I would argue, the least popular thing that we do talk about. And when Josh, the greatest producer in the world, cuts shorts for that topic too, they don't pick up. The algorithm doesn't pick it up. People don't engage with it because they don't want to hear about it.
It has been interesting, isn't it, as we've become the world's greatest podcast. And you're right. You got to play with the titles to try to get people into like when we did the like your sermon, they got hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of hits, and then the follow up on I'm forgetting the Latin title of
Fiducia supplicans.
Fiducia supplicans, right? And then our shorts would get thousands of hits, and this podcast got 10,000 hits, and your sermon got 35,000 hits, right? But then when we go to a topic like this, which is even more important.
Well, yeah, way more important.
Yeah, infinitely more important, right? Because gay relationships aren't going to produce any children, right? Right? Unless they do it artificially, right? Which defies everything about natural law and will just mess up everybody psychologically for generations to come. They don't talk about this at all. Even, I shouldn't say it all, but it's so minuscule. Even the top Catholic podcast, never mind the evangelical podcast, never touched this subject. Even the top Catholic podcasts don't touch this subject. And it makes no sense.
Yeah.
Right? They talk about endlessly about, is Francis the real Pope? Who's going to be the next Pope? Are we going to go back to JP2 in Benedict XVI? Will there be a reversal of the trend? They're missing the forest through the whole trees. The reason why this is happening is because the church hasn't taught anything for 45 years, 60 years.
Bingo.
Right? It's been more about, we need to have the spirit of Vatican II and be open to all this other stuff, but stop talking about, there's nothing more central to the core of the gospel than marriage and the birth of children. Nothing. Right? It goes back all the way to the commandment from Genesis, after Genesis 1:27. Be fruitful and multiply, right? When we ignore that, we're done, right? We're done.
Literally.
Yeah, we're done. And Lewis is just all over it. And here's a guy, who never had any children.
Yeah, he was so far ahead of the curve with all of these ideas. So my conclusion, making our way through Abolition of Man, one of the things that's nice also about Lewis is he writes so concise, so the books are nice and short.
Yes.
You devour them pretty quickly.
I wish there was more pictures.
Yeah, there's a real lack of pictures. Maybe for the next edition they can whip something up there.
Josh is doing a revision. He's drawing pictures for him, so it's going to be really cool.
Little doodles. So we can't wait.
Yeah.
He's a man of many talents.
Yes, he is.
Joshua. But I assert that a dogmatic belief in objective value is necessary to the very idea of a rule, which is not tyranny, or an obedience, which is not slavery. So in other words, you can't, if you apply it to government, for example, you can't have a functioning self-government without objective morality. Otherwise, you devolve into either a slavery or you devolve into tyranny.
That's so profound because, right, our last podcast we talk about, which would have been aired around the election, right? This is exactly the problem facing, quite frankly, both parties, because both parties just lie through their teeth about this, right? Unless we have more children born, there will be nobody to pay taxes. You can yak on about all you want about Social Security and this thing and this program and that and the Green Initiative, right? It's never going to happen because only humans who are born, who are raised in a culture, who possess skills and education, then create industry and ingenuity, that produces jobs and tax base, right? Without that, you have nothing. But they never talk about the truth,
no.
Right? They just we're like, Josh, he's a Republican. I don't know if he is or not, but I suspect he might be. But I said, you're a Republican. You're about making us eat dog food and taking away Social Security, right? Which is all a lie, right? Because Social Security is just going to go bankrupt. So it's got nothing to do about that. And that's what Lewis is saying. He's going, you just deal with make-believe things. You don't deal with concrete reality about what the essence of human existence is about.
And so Lewis, again, way ahead of us as always, offers a rebuttal to that sort of objection. If you've got a subjectivity which leads to tyranny, that has infected our very language. And he goes on to rebut those who accuse him of rejecting science altogether, right? By positing that many modern scientists who are beholden to an ideology, and modern in his age, right, is 60, 80 years ago, are not all that different from the magicians of the past. So, in fact, both modern scientists and magicians gained popularity in the 16th and 17th centuries out of an impulse to subdue reality rather than conform to it. This is the argument that he makes.
Right.
So modern science just happened to thrive while magic died out, but they were both trying out the same things at the same time. So you end up with modern science because it thrived, and in some cases it worked, but the philosophies behind it were the same. The modern scientist may reject magic because it doesn't work, but he has the same desire as the magician who started at the same time as him in medieval times, which would be knowledge as a tool to increase and exercise human power. So knowledge is that tool to increase power, and Lewis concludes this by saying, its triumphs have been too rapid, speaking of science, its triumphs have been too rapid and purchased at too high a price. Reconsideration and something like repentance may be required.
I love that line about repentance. You know, how many times has science decided they're absolutely right about something?
Yeah.
And it goes, time proves that you're not absolutely right about something, right? It goes back to our conversation, several podcasts about Dawkins, right? Mm-hmm. Dawkins is complaining about the decay of Christian culture, which he spent his whole life trying to destroy, and now he's lamenting that Christian culture is going away. Or who's the famous physicist that died back a few years ago?
Stephen Hawking.
Stephen Hawking, right? Is like, it's interesting. I've been reading some, in the last 6 months, Hawkins insisting before he died that the universe could have came out of existence out of nothing. Mm-hmm. And now there's I wouldn't say a myriad, there's a significant flow now of physicists and other scientists saying that's not true.
Yeah.
There's zero evidence that could be true. Right. But he went to his I gave a somewhat infamous sermon about that, saying, I hope he enjoys wherever he is, since something outside of supernatural created order brought this into existence. And so science will do this. It's done it throughout history, right? When the church famously declared that our great scientist, the medieval period, that the Earth's not the center of the universe.
Oh, you're thinking of Copernicus.
Copernicus, right? In this line, like, nope, Copernicus is wrong. Well, Copernicus was right? It's kind of the opposite.
Burned him
here.
at the stake, yeah.
It's the opposite here. Like, in the last 50 years, we get these absolute things, right? And then they find out, my gosh, the universe is a bigger mystery than we're ever going to solve.
Yeah.
And that will always be the case, because the Creator is infinite. And he's omniscient. And we are this tiny little speck.
Infinitesimally small.
In an infinite universe, right. And Lewis knew that 80 years ago. Yeah.
So Lewis wraps up this book here by imagining what he calls a natural philosophy, which I think is very appropriate, which instead seeks to explain without explaining away. So that's really the crux of the entire argument that he's making, is modern philosophers, modern scientists, they seek to explain everything away, and in essence, you destroy the thing in which you have, quote unquote, now understood. So it seeks to analyze without destroying. It studies the parts while remembering the whole, and it illuminates the conscience without diminishing it to instinct. So this is what he calls a redeemed science, and it reminds me of like a calorimeter, which requires an object to be burned. If you've done like a science experiment in high school, you burn the object in order to determine the energy which has been released, and that's emblematic of, I think, the type of theorizing and technological advancements that have been made, where with every technological advancement, there is also an increase in, there is a poverty, a type of poverty that we gain, something that we lose with every supposed step forward that we make.
Right.
So C.S. Lewis warns against the fatal serialism of the modern imagination. He says, the image of infinite unilinear progression which so haunts our minds. That sounds very familiar to our current age. Someone must be bold enough to arrest the process of modern science or set up barriers before it takes the final step of reaching common reason and consuming that too. I wonder if it isn't already too late, he says. So you cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see what lies beyond it. But if you see through everything, if you've deconstructed everything, then everything is transparent and you now live in a wholly transparent and invisible world. And that's really how he concludes the argument is there's nothing left once you've deconstructed everything. And that's you end up with men without chests. There's no more virtue to behold.
And there's no genius today that can refute what he has said.
No. No, they can get mad about the things that they don't like.
He just wrote children's stories.
Yeah.
It's
just a very simple
something
mind.
just to end on is the fascination with Tolkien, right?
Yeah.
In the last 20 years, since the rise of all his stories that have made millions of dollars for people, how tied those two were.
It's a really cool story.
Yeah, in the common room. And Tolkien was a devout Catholic, and Lewis remained an Anglican. But they have, in their way, they've bent, haven't they? They've bent part of those willing to pay it, are interested in things eternal. They've bent part of the social conscience through the success 70, 80 years later of their writings.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, way more so with Tolkien, because I think C.S. Lewis was much more heavy-handed in his use of allegory in his writings. Yes. So there's really no way around the imagery. Like you look at Aslan, for example, and C.S. Lewis, right. You can't.
That's Jesus.
Yeah, you can't rob the imagery of Jesus from that. But Tolkien being much more subtle and intricate with the world in which he crafted, it absolutely just the fantasy elements have been taken at the expense of leaving aside the Christian morality and the natural law that undergirded and what makes that universe so beautiful and interesting and compelling even to this day.
Yeah, they were so great at what they did. You can see the rise of all this godless comic hero stuff that is making up. It tries to fill this void, but it can't do it because it's not based on the divine, right? It's just based on fantasy.
Yeah.
Right. Like, as opposed to the ultimate hero for Lewis and Tolkien is the Almighty, and that's not the case in what Marvel comic heroes are trying to fill this void in the American soul.
Exactly.
It'll never work.
It's empty.
It's right.
It's empty. There's no ultimate truth being served there, and it ends up instead being used to forward the agendas of the writers and producers, pretty much, and which is why they will decline in popularity.
Yes.
Eventually.
Yes.
Get tiresome.
Well, it's the same.
It's like eating sugar.
Yeah, it's like chewing on cud. It's the same story every single time. So you just like, hey, I just spent $40 for that.
Yeah.
And you just say, I've had enough of that. Pretty cool.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis, Abolition of Man, really, really fascinating. And
we could come back to Lewis
book.
Every other issue and talk for 4 hours. So.
Yeah, we've got plenty of C.S. Lewis material.
Yeah.
So we can talk him up anytime. Hopefully, all of you, our dear listeners and viewers, enjoyed this conversation just as much. Highly recommend Abolition of Man and really reading any of C.S. Lewis. But once again, thank you for listening to us today, to this episode of the Lively Faith Podcast.
Thanks to Josh.
Thank you, Josh, as always, our fearless producer, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. God bless.